The letter hit the floor of Amos Watkins's barn like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through him would not stop for a very long time. He had found it tucked beneath the coffee tin on the kitchen table, written in Edna Wallace's careful, schoolteacher hand, the ink still dark and deliberate, every letter formed as though she had been composing it in her mind for weeks, because she had. He knew that now with a certainty that hurt worse than any physical wound he had ever carried across the plains of Colorado. I said from the first day I arrived that I would not stay past spring, the letter read. I said it plainly and I meant it plainly, and I need you to understand, Amos, that what has grown between us this winter does not change the fact that my life, my real life, exists somewhere else. I am sorry. I am deeply sorry. But when the thaw comes and the roads open, I will be leaving. I think it is better that you know this now, in the cold heart of January, than to wake up one morning in April and find me already gone. He read it 3 times standing in the kitchen doorway with snow falling soft and relentless outside, and each time it hit him differently. The first time it hit him like surprise, raw and breathless. The second time it hit him like grief. The third time it hit him like something harder and more dangerous, something he recognized from the years he had spent on the frontier before he had built this ranch, and decided that a man could choose stillness if he wanted it badly enough. It hit him like a refusal to accept. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and walked out into the snow. But to understand what Amos Watkins did next, you have to understand how Edna Wallace came to be at that kitchen table in the first place, writing that letter with her careful schoolteacher hand, and you have to go back to the very beginning of it, back to October, when the first cold fingers of autumn had begun pressing down across the Colorado territory, and a woman with dark hair and a sharper tongue than anyone in the town of Harlan's Creek had ever encountered stepped off the stage with 2 leather trunks and a piece of paper that named her as the new schoolteacher. The year was 1878, and Harlan's Creek was a town that had been clawing its way into existence for 6 years, built on silver money and cattle money, and the kind of stubborn human optimism that plants itself in hard ground and insists on growing. It had a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a saloon that the preacher pretended not to see from his front porch, and now, finally, a proper school that the town council had spent 3 months constructing out of pine lumber and determination. What it had not had until now was a teacher willing to come all the way from Davenport, Iowa, to fill the position. Edna Wallace was 26 years old, and she had spent the last 4 years teaching in a city school, living in a boarding house with 2 other women teachers, eating in restaurants, attending lectures at the Cultural Institute, and building what she considered to be a very adequate and self-sufficient life. She had not planned to come to Colorado. She had applied to the position on a dare, essentially, after a particularly difficult evening during which she had drunk 2 glasses of sherry with her friend Margaret and declared loudly that she was not afraid of anything. Margaret had pointed to the posting in the Teacher's Gazette. "They want someone for Colorado territory," Margaret had said, "somewhere called Harlan's Creek. It says the nearest city is 4 hours by stage." "I am not afraid of Colorado," Edna had said, mostly to hear herself say it. She had sent the letter of inquiry the next morning, half expecting to hear nothing back. And when the offer arrived 6 weeks later with a salary that was frankly better than what she was earning in Davenport and an assurance of room and board, she had sat very still for a long time and then written her letter of acceptance, because Edna Wallace, whatever her faults, was not a woman who backed down from what she said she was not afraid of. She planned to stay 1 year. That was what she told Margaret. 1 school year, September to June, and then she would come back to Davenport with money saved and a story to tell. She arrived in October because the wagon roads had been impassable in September due to flooding, and she arrived with the distinct awareness that everything she could see from the stage window was vast, and largely empty in a way that made her feel simultaneously free and terrified, which was a combination she did not entirely trust. The problem with her accommodations became apparent within the first hour. The room and board that had been promised in the contract was supposed to be at the home of the school board chairman, a man named Gerald Fitch, whose wife Agnes had agreed to take in a boarder. What Edna discovered when she arrived was that Agnes Fitch had taken very suddenly and severely ill 2 weeks prior, and with a sick wife and 3 young children underfoot, Gerald Fitch was standing on the main street of Harlan's Creek looking profoundly uncomfortable as he explained to Edna that the arrangement was, temporarily, impossible. "We'll find you something," Gerald said, running his hat through his hands. "The town wants you here, Miss Wallace. We'll find you something proper." The something proper that the town found, after 2 days during which Edna slept on a cot in the back of the general store and tried not to take it personally, was Amos Watkins. Amos Watkins owned the largest working cattle ranch within 20 miles of Harlan's Creek. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a quality of stillness that some people found comforting and other people found unnerving. He had built his ranch over 7 years of hard and sometimes desperate work, and he lived in it alone in a way that was not quite loneliness and not quite contentment, but somewhere in that complicated territory between the two. He had a full-time ranch hand named Pete Colby who lived in the bunkhouse, and he had a cook named Della who came in 3 mornings a week from town, and he had a big stone fireplace and a spare room at the end of the hall that he had been using to store saddle equipment because there was no one to put in it. Gerald Fitch came to him on a Tuesday morning and laid out the situation plainly. The town needed the teacher housed. The only place within reasonable distance of the school that had a spare room and a decent woman's situation was Amos's ranch. Would Amos be willing? Amos was quiet for a long moment, which was characteristic of him. Then he said, "How long?" "Just until Agnes is well enough to take in a boarder again," Gerald said. "Could be a few weeks." It was not a few weeks, but neither of them knew that yet. Edna arrived at the Watkins ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late October with her 2 leather trunks and an expression of careful neutrality that she wore the way other women wore bonnets, as a habitual protection against whatever the weather might bring. She had been told that the rancher was a bachelor, which she noted with the same professional detachment she applied to most information. She had also been told he was quiet and decent, which in her experience could mean almost anything. What she had not been told, because Gerald Fitch was not a man who thought in those terms, was that Amos Watkins had a quality about him that was difficult to name precisely. It was something in the way he moved through his own space, unhurried and certain, as though he had made a deliberate peace with every corner of his life and everything in it. It was something in the way he looked at her when Pete Colby drove the wagon up to the front of the house, and Amos came out to meet it, not with the assessing once-over she had grown accustomed to from men who saw a woman traveling alone and made rapid calculations, but with a straightforward, serious attention that seemed to be asking not what she looked like but who she was. "Miss Wallace," he said, and reached up to take her trunk before she had time to manage it herself. "Mr. Watkins," she said, and followed him inside. The house was better than she had expected, which she refused to let show on her face, because she had already decided that she would maintain very clear professional boundaries and not become comfortable in a situation that was explicitly temporary. The kitchen was large and warm. The spare room had a real bed with a proper mattress and a window that looked out across the snow-dusted pasture toward the mountains. There was a writing desk in the corner that someone had clearly cleared and positioned for her use, and beside it a small stack of candles. "Della leaves breakfast things in the morning she doesn't come," Amos said from the doorway. He was not looking at her directly now, she noticed, just at the general vicinity of the room as though checking that everything was in order. "You're welcome to the kitchen whenever you need it. The schoolhouse is 3 miles by the road, about 2.5 cutting through the south pasture. I'll have Pete drive you mornings until you know the way." "That's very kind," she said. "It's practical," he said, and left her to settle in. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment after he was gone and listened to the silence of the ranch, which was a different kind of silence than the city, layered with wind and the distant sounds of cattle and the creak of a substantial house settling around her. She told herself firmly that she would be here a few weeks, perhaps a month, and then back to Agnes Fitch's, and then through the school year, and then home to Davenport. She was very clear about all of this. She was also, beneath the clarity, obscurely and irritatingly moved by the fact that someone had put candles next to the writing desk. The first 2 weeks passed in a pattern. Edna taught school from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, 17 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old, in various states of willingness. She was a good teacher, patient in the ways that mattered and demanding in the ways that also mattered. And the children, after an initial period of testing her limits with the precise professional dedication of small creatures who understand power dynamics intuitively, settled into a workable rhythm with her. She ate dinner at the Watkins house because it was her arrangement, and Amos ate dinner at the Watkins house because he lived there, and so they ate together in the evenings at the kitchen table, which was in some ways the most significant development of those first weeks, though neither of them recognized it as such. They talked, at first, the way two people share a house as strangers: weather, the children, the school, the town's history, which Amos knew thoroughly, and shared with the economy of someone who considers words worth measuring before spending them. Edna asked questions because she was curious about everything, and because she had quickly recognized that Amos Watkins was someone who gave you exactly what you asked for and very little more unless you pressed, which she found maddening and then fascinating and then, quietly, respectful. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape gradually as the light changes. He had come to Colorado from Kentucky at 22, following a friend who had heard there was opportunity in the cattle trade. The friend had lasted 1 winter and gone home. Amos had stayed. He had worked for 3 different ranches before saving enough to claim his own land, and the ranch he had built over 7 years, he had designed himself down to the placement of the barn, and the direction the house faced to catch the morning light. He had done this alone, or nearly alone, and he spoke of it not with pride but with a kind of steady matter-of-factness that was somehow more impressive than pride would have been. "Didn't you want someone to share it with?" she asked one evening, perhaps 3 weeks into her stay, over a dinner of salt pork and potatoes that Della had left for them. He looked up from his plate. "I've been building it," he said. Seemed like the time to think about sharing comes after the thing worth sharing exists. She thought about that for a long time afterward. She had not told him, that first week or even that second, about why she had really come to Colorado. She had given him the version she gave everyone, the posting in the Gazette, the better salary, the spirit of adventure. It was not a lie, exactly. It was more like a road that stopped several miles before the actual destination. The actual destination involved a man named Charles Whitmore, who had been her understanding in Davenport for 2 years, and who had, 8 months before she boarded the stage for Colorado, told her very gently that he had formed an attachment to someone else, a woman from a good family with money and connections that Edna, a schoolteacher from a modest background, could not provide. He had said it kindly. He had said it as though kindness could absorb the structural damage of the thing, as though a gentle voice was the same as not destroying something. Edna had not cried in front of him. She had not cried privately either, not for several weeks, not until Margaret had found her sitting in the kitchen of the boarding house at 2 in the morning with a cup of cold tea, and asked what was actually wrong, and then she had cried until she was embarrassed by the amount of it. The posting in the Gazette was not entirely a dare. It was also an escape, and the escape was also a decision that she was going to build herself back into someone solid and self-sufficient, who did not need the approval or affection of any man to define the shape of her life. She had made this decision with considerable conviction, and she intended to keep it. She was staying 1 year. She was going home to Davenport. She was not going to let anything or anyone change that plan. The snow came in earnest in November, and with it came a series of small, unavoidable intimacies that Edna attempted to regard with professional detachment and found increasingly difficult to maintain. The first was practical. The road between the ranch and the town became impassable for 5 days in the second week of November after a heavy storm, which meant Edna could not reach the school and also could not go anywhere else, which meant she and Amos Watkins were snowbound together in his ranch house, with the wind coming down from the mountains like something alive and angry, and the fire in the stone hearth the most important thing in the world. Pete Colby was in the bunkhouse. He had his own small stove and enough provisions, and was perfectly fine. Edna and Amos were in the main house, and on the second day of the storm, when even going to the barn to check the horses was a negotiation with the weather, something in the forced proximity shifted. They had run out of neutral topics. Edna had, in quiet desperation, gone to the small bookshelf in the sitting room and pulled out a volume of poetry she recognized, Longfellow, and had settled herself near the fire with it. Amos had looked up from the harness he was mending at the kitchen table. "You like poetry," he said. "I teach it," she said. "I'm not sure that's the same thing." "What's the difference?" She considered this seriously because it was a serious question. "Teaching it means understanding what it means and what it does technically," she said. "Liking it means it does something to you that you didn't expect." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does that one do something to you?" She looked down at the page. She had it open to "The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls," which she had not chosen deliberately and now felt embarrassed about because it was a poem about mortality and the indifference of time, and it seemed excessively revealing to be reading it in a stranger's house during a snowstorm. "Sometimes," she said. "Read it," he said. She looked up. He had said it plainly, not as a command but as an invitation, and there was nothing in his expression that made it feel like she was being watched or evaluated, just that steady attention. She read it, the whole of it, aloud, and when she finished the room was very quiet except for the fire. "The tide doesn't wait," he said after a moment. "No," she said. "Neither does anything else out here," he said. He said it without bitterness, just as fact, and then he went back to the harness. But something had opened between them, some small door, and it did not close again afterward. By the time the road cleared and Edna returned to school, she had also, without entirely deciding to do so, told Amos about Charles Whitmore. Not everything, not the depth of the specific humiliation, but she told him that there had been a man in Davenport and that it had ended badly, and that this was, in part, why she had wanted a year away from that life. Amos had listened to this with the particular quality of attention he gave to serious things. When she finished, he did not offer her sympathy or advice. He said, "What are you planning to do when the year is over?" "Go back," she said. "I told you, 1 year." "And then what? Pick up where you left off?" "Not with him," she said. "But the life, the city, yes." He nodded slowly. He did not argue with her. He did not try to suggest that the plan was wrong or misguided. He simply accepted it as the fact she had presented it as, and something about that acceptance made her feel, perversely, as though she wanted to argue the case against it herself. She did not. She went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the wind and thought about the way he had said, "Neither does anything else out here," as though he had learned this lesson personally and at some cost. December arrived and brought with it the quality of winter that Edna had not experienced in Iowa, a profound and immersive cold that was not just temperature but atmosphere, that made the ranch feel like the only warm thing in a vast cold universe, and made the distances between buildings feel philosophically significant. She stopped thinking of her time at the ranch as temporary housing and started thinking of it as simply where she was, which she recognized was a subtle but important distinction. Agnes Fitch recovered from her illness in December, and Gerald came out to the ranch to tell Edna that the room at the Fitch house was ready whenever she wanted it. Edna thanked him politely and said she would give it some thought. She gave it no thought whatsoever. The Fitch house was small and loud with children, and Agnes, while kind, was the sort of woman who asked personal questions in the earnest belief that this constituted friendship. The ranch was quiet and had a writing desk with candles and a man who read the same pages she read and didn't flinch from the difficult conversations. She told herself she was staying because the logistics were simpler. The ranch was closer to the road to the school. She was already settled. It would be disruptive to move. These were not untrue reasons. They were also not the whole reason. The whole reason was something she was not prepared to examine directly in December, because examining it directly would require acknowledging that Amos Watkins was becoming, without any dramatic announcement or overt pursuit, one of the most important people in her daily world. And she was not going to stay past spring. She had said so. She intended it. She was going home. It was in December that she learned about the dark past that Amos carried in the same quiet way he carried everything else, not volunteering it, not hiding it, just holding it as a fact of himself. The revelation came not from him directly but from Pete Colby, which Amos almost certainly would not have sanctioned if he had known it was happening. Pete was a lean, weathered man of 40 who had been with Amos for 3 years, and had the comfortable bluntness of someone who considers tact an unnecessary luxury. Edna had found him in the barn one afternoon when she had come back from school earlier than expected, and they had fallen into conversation about the horses, which she was cautiously learning to manage with Pete's instruction, and somehow it had turned to Amos, the way conversations often turned to Amos in Harlan's Creek, because he was the kind of person who occupied the center of things without appearing to try. He was with the Marshalls for a while, Pete said, forking hay with the efficient rhythm of long practice. Federal Marshals out of Denver, before he had the ranch. Chased down some bad men across 3 territories and saw some things that I think a man needs a lot of land and a lot of quiet to put behind him. He doesn't talk about it. I know he doesn't, Edna said. He won't, Pete confirmed. But you should know it because it explains some things about him. He built this ranch like a man who needed to build something instead of tear it down. There's a difference between a man who's at peace and a man who chose peace on purpose. Amos is the second kind. Edna thought about this for several days. She thought about it while she was teaching fractions, and while she was grading spelling papers, and while she was eating dinner across the kitchen table from the man in question, who was at peace because he had chosen it deliberately, which was not the same as never having been anything else. She asked him about it finally on a Sunday evening in mid-December when the snow was falling outside, and they had been sitting by the fire for an hour. She reading, he doing nothing she could identify except existing with that quality of settled stillness that she had at some point stopped finding unnerving and started finding, she admitted privately, profoundly comforting. He told me you were a federal marshal, she said. He looked up. A pause, not long but present. That's right. Was it bad? Yes, he said, no embellishment. Is that why you came here to the ranch? He looked into the fire for a moment. I was good at what I did, he said. That's a difficult thing, being good at something you don't want to keep doing. You feel the obligation of it. I did it until I knew that if I kept going I was going to become something I couldn't respect. He paused. So I stopped. I built this instead. She put her book down. How long ago? 4 years. And you don't miss it. Miss what exactly? The work, sometimes. The people I was with, yes. The things I saw, no. She looked at him steadily. What kinds of things? He met her gaze. Things that make you understand that cruelty isn't exceptional, he said. It's a choice that ordinary people make when they think no one's watching or when they have enough power that it doesn't matter who's watching. I saw a lot of that. He picked up his coffee cup. This ranch is a different kind of choice, every day. She realized, sitting there in the firelight with the snow coming down outside, that she had never met a man who used the word choice the way Amos Watkins used it, like it was a serious and weighty thing that deserved to be handled carefully. Charles Whitmore had made choices. He had just never seemed to understand that they had weight. She picked up her book again. She did not trust what she was feeling because she was not staying past spring, but she memorized the look on his face in the firelight as though it was something she would need later. She wrote the letter in the first week of January. She wrote it because she was frightened. That was the honest reason. She was frightened not of Amos but of herself, of the way she noticed the specific warmth of sitting at the same table as him, of the way she had started listening for his footstep on the porch when she came home from school, of the way she had caught herself thinking, twice in 1 week, about what the ranch would look like in spring when the snow melted and the pastures came green again, as though she would be there to see it. She would not be there to see it. She had said so. She was going home to Davenport, and she was going to build the life she had planned. She was not going to let another man rearrange the architecture of her intentions. The letter was a reminder. She wrote it partly for him and partly for herself, as a commitment committed to paper, as a wall built with words. She put it on the table under the coffee tin where he would see it in the morning, and she went to bed feeling like she had done something sensible and necessary. She had not expected the way he would receive it. He walked out into the snow. She watched from her window, not knowing she was watching, her hand against the cold glass, as he stood in the yard in the early morning with his coat on and his breath making clouds in the air. He stood there a long time. Then he walked to the barn. He did not come back into the house for 2 hours. When he did, he said nothing about the letter. He sat down at the kitchen table and ate the breakfast he made himself without looking at her with any particular expression, just the regular morning expression of a man eating breakfast. And then he put on his coat and went to check the cattle. She waited all day for the argument she had braced herself for. It did not come. What came instead, over the following days, was something more difficult and more interesting than an argument. He started talking to her differently. Not more necessarily, but with a different quality of intentionality, as though he had made a decision that if she was going to leave in spring, then he was going to make sure she left knowing exactly what she was leaving. Not to trap her, not through manipulation, but through the simple, devastating strategy of being completely himself. The first thing he did was show her the ranch in winter, not the house and the barn that she already knew, but the whole of it, the south pasture and the eastern ridge and the place where the creek ran under the ice, and you could hear it if you put your ear near the frozen surface, still moving, still alive, still finding its way through. He brought her there on horseback on a Saturday morning in early January, 2 horses, side by side through the snow, and she had been riding for 2 months now with Pete's instruction, and she managed it without embarrassing herself. The cold was deep and the sky was a blue so intense it seemed almost violent, and when they reached the eastern ridge and she could see the whole valley laid out below, the ranch buildings and the frozen creek and the distant mountains wearing their white hoods, she understood for the first time in a visceral, not intellectual, way what it meant to build something with your hands in a place this large. "It's enormous," she said. "Yes," he said. "How much of it is yours?" 340 acres. I want to get to 500 in the next few years. He paused. There's good land to the north, good water. She looked out at the valley. What would you do with 500 acres? More cattle, maybe some horses, proper breeding stock. He was quiet for a moment. A bigger school. She looked at him. That's not your business. No, he agreed. But it's something the valley needs. The school you're teaching in is too small already. 2 more families have come in since September. The town would have to fund it. I could fund a good part of it, he said simply. She stared at him. You would do that? He looked at her steadily. I told you, I'm building something. A ranch is just the physical part. She turned back to look at the valley and felt something shift inside her that she could not immediately identify. It was not attraction, or it was not only attraction. It was recognition. The recognition of a person whose ambitions were built toward something rather than away from something. She had spent 2 years in Davenport with Charles Whitmore, who had been built entirely away from things he feared, and she had not known the difference until she saw the contrast this clearly. She did not tell him what she was thinking. She said, "We should get back. It's cold." "Yes," he agreed, and turned his horse around and said nothing more about it. But she thought about it all the way home. The second thing he did was introduce her to the town in a new way. Not the formal introduction of the new schoolteacher, which had already happened, but the actual fabric of the community, the stories and connections and histories that made Harlan's Creek more than a collection of buildings. He brought her to the gathering at the church hall in the second week of January, a community supper that happened monthly and that she had attended before but always slightly at the edges of, the new person, the outsider, the professional visitor who was not quite part of the permanent picture. This time she went with Amos, and she discovered that Amos Watkins in his community was a slightly different creature than Amos Watkins at his kitchen table. He was still quiet, still economical with his words, but he was also something that she could only describe as deeply rooted, known by these people in a specific and substantive way, trusted in the way that you trust someone who has shown up consistently over years and not asked for acknowledgement. She watched him listen to an older farmer named Horace Dent talk about a problem with his fencing, and she watched Amos give him, in 3 sentences, a practical solution that the man accepted immediately because it was obviously correct. She watched him crouch down to speak to the 6-year-old daughter of a widow named Clara who was in Edna's class, speaking to the child with the same seriousness he used with adults, and she watched the child's face light up because being taken seriously is a very specific gift and children know when they are receiving it. "How do you know everyone this well?" she asked him on the drive home, the wagon moving through the dark overpacked snow with the stars above them extraordinary in the clear winter sky. "I've been here 7 years," he said. "It's more than that," he thought about it. "When you choose a place," he said, "you take on the obligation of knowing it, not just the land. The people, if you don't do that, you're just a tenant, not a neighbor." She looked up at the stars for a long moment. "I've never lived anywhere long enough to know it that way," she said. "Davenport. I grew up there, but I was always going to leave it even before I knew I was." "Where were you going to?" She paused. "I don't know, somewhere. I always thought there was somewhere I was supposed to be that I hadn't found yet." He let that sit for a moment in the cold air. Then he said, very quietly, "And do you know yet?" She felt the question in her chest like something warm pressing against her sternum. She looked straight ahead at the horses and the snow and the dark road. "I'm going home in spring," she said. "I know," he said, and said nothing else. She did not sleep well that night. It was Clara's daughter, a child named May, who was responsible for what happened in the last week of January in a way that could not have been planned and perhaps should not have worked but did. May was 7 years old and small for her age and possessed of a cough that had worried Edna since early December, but that had, with the January cold, grown worse. Clara was a widow who had come to Colorado with her husband 2 years ago, and whose husband had died of a fever 6 months after their arrival, leaving her with May, a small plot of land, and a fierce and exhausting independence that she wore like armor. On a Thursday morning, May arrived at school with a fever as well as the cough, and Edna sent her home immediately with a note, and that afternoon she rode to Clara's homestead, which was 4 miles from the Watkins ranch, to check on them because the child's color had been wrong in a way that troubled her. What she found when she arrived was that Clara was herself ill, not as severely as May, but ill enough that she was moving through the small cabin with a white-lipped determination that was clearly costing her considerably, and May was in bed with a fever that, when Edna put her hand to the child's forehead, made her stomach drop. She rode back to the ranch at a pace that was not entirely safe on the winter roads and found Amos in the barn. She told him what she had found, and she watched his face do nothing dramatic at all, just absorb the information and begin moving. He had Pete hitch the wagon. He took the medicine chest that he kept stocked because he was 40 miles from a doctor, and had been managing frontier medical situations for years, not with expertise but with practicality and the knowledge of what was serious and what was not. He drove back to Clara's with Edna beside him, and what followed was 2 days during which he and Edna essentially took over the running of Clara's household while Clara recovered and May's fever broke and came down, and then broke again in a pattern that terrified Edna and that Amos managed with a steadiness that she would think about for a long time afterward. He was not a doctor. He did not pretend to be one. But he knew what a child needed with a fever. He knew to keep the temperature down and keep her drinking water and keep the cabin warm but not too warm. And he knew when to be worried and when to wait. And he was present through both of those with a quality of attention that asked nothing back from the child or the mother and gave everything that was needed. On the second night, when May's fever finally broke properly and the child fell into a genuine and deep sleep, Edna found herself sitting beside Amos on the bench outside Clara's door in the freezing January night, both of them wrapped in coats, breathing cold air after 2 days of close quarters, and she was aware that she was crying without having decided to cry, quiet tears that she did not notice until they were cold on her face. Amos noticed. He did not say anything. He put his arm around her shoulders and she let him, and they sat in the dark while the stars were enormous and the cold was absolute, and inside the cabin, a child breathed steadily in safe sleep. She did not move away from the weight of his arm. She did not tell herself that she was going home in spring. She sat with her shoulder against his shoulder and felt the warmth of him in the cold and thought nothing at all for what felt like the first time in months. She thought about it, though, after. She thought about it for the rest of January and into February while May recovered fully, and Clara sent Edna a jar of jam and a handwritten note that said more in 7 words than most letters managed in 7 pages. She thought about what it meant to sit in the dark with someone and feel safe. She had thought in Davenport that safety came from institutions, from contracts and understandings, and the formal structures of society. She had thought it came from the right kind of respectability, and the right kind of address, and the right kind of man with the right kind of family connections. Charles Whitmore had seemed to offer all of that, right up until the moment he had offered it to someone else instead. What Amos Watkins offered was something she did not have a name for that fit neatly into the categories she had brought with her from Davenport. He was not respectable in the city sense. He was a rancher in a small town in Colorado Territory, with a past in law enforcement that he did not advertise, and a present that he had built entirely on his own terms. He was not going to give her a life in a city or proximity to cultural institutes or the kind of social world she had imagined for herself. But he had put his arm around her in the dark, and she had felt, for the first time since Charles Whitmore's gentle and devastating announcement, entirely safe. She was very frightened by this, and she did not know what to do with it. In February, something happened that changed the stakes significantly. A man named Rance Holloway arrived in Harlan's Creek. He was an acquaintance from Amos's Marshall days, not a friend, an acquaintance, which is a meaningfully different category. And what he brought with him was trouble in the specific form of information that forced Amos's dark past into the present, with a violence that the careful peace of the ranch had been built to prevent. Holloway showed up at the ranch on a Tuesday morning, and Edna was there because school was closed for the day due to a situation with the heating system in the schoolhouse, and she watched from the kitchen window as Amos met him in the yard with a body language she had not seen before, careful and closed and very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. She heard them from the kitchen, not the words, just the tones. Holloway's voice urgent and pressuring, Amos's voice flat and final. Then Holloway left and Amos came inside and stood for a moment with his back to her at the kitchen door. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "Who was he?" she asked. He turned. His face was composed, but she had learned enough of him by now to read what was happening underneath the composure. "A man I used to work with. He's involved in something I want no part of." "What kind of something?" A pause. She could see him deciding how much to tell her, and she watched the decision land because he had clearly decided that she deserved the truth, which was something she appreciated in him. "There was a man I put in prison 6 years ago," Amos said. "A man named Garrett Cole. He ran a criminal operation across 3 territories, robbery, extortion, worse. I was the lead officer on the case. Cole is out of prison now, early release, and Holloway says he's been making inquiries about me, about where I ended up." Edna felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Inquiries meaning what exactly? Meaning Garrett Cole is a man who holds grudges and has resources and has now had 6 years to decide what he wants to do about the person who put him away. She stared at him. "Amos, I'm telling you because you deserve to know," he said. "I don't believe he's coming here immediately. I don't know for certain, but you should know." She thought about the secret she had been keeping from herself for weeks, the one that lived in her chest in the space behind the word spring, and she thought about what it would mean if something happened to him. The thought was intolerable in a way that made the entire careful structure of her plan feel suddenly very fragile. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Write to the marshal's office in Denver," he said. "Ask them to keep a watch on Cole's movements, and be careful. That's all." He looked at her steadily. "What else would you have me do?" "Come with me," she said, and then was shocked to have said it, and then was more shocked to discover that she meant it. He was very quiet for a moment. "Come with you where?" "Davenport," she said, and then felt the absurdity of it land on her and closed her eyes for a moment. "That's not what I meant. I don't know what I meant." "I think you do know," he said very gently, and did not press it further. She spent the rest of that day in a state of barely managed interior chaos, and went to bed early and lay awake until well past midnight thinking about what she had said and what it implied and what it meant about what she was feeling. She was in love with him. She acknowledged this to herself at approximately 2 in the morning with the resignation of a person who has been fighting a tide and has finally stopped and let the water take them. She was in love with Amos Watkins, who was quiet and enormous in his stillness, and who had chosen peace on purpose, who had put his arm around her in the dark, who had shown her a frozen creek that was still alive underneath the ice. She was in love with him, and she was still going home in spring because being in love with someone in a place you could not stay was a trap, a beautiful and terrible trap, and she had already been in one of those, and she knew what happened when the door closed. Except she was the one who had built this trap. She had built it with her own words. "I'm not staying past spring," and she had been so certain when she said it, and she was so uncertain now. And the difference between those 2 states of certainty was every day of this winter, every dinner and every evening by the fire and every conversation, and one frozen Saturday morning on the eastern ridge, and one cold dark night outside a child's sick room. Amos had not tried to change her mind in any of the ways she had been guarding against. He had not argued. He had not pleaded. He had not tried to seduce her or manipulate her or offer her promises that existed to bind rather than to liberate. He had simply lived his life beside her with complete and visible honesty and let her see it, all of it, the work and the land and the community and the past and the peace he had chosen, and the space that existed within that peace for a person who might choose to stay in it. He was not changing her mind. He was showing her what she had been wrong about, which was harder to fight than any argument. February continued, and with it came a development in the Garrett Cole situation that clarified several things at once. The letter from the marshal's office in Denver arrived in the 2nd week of February. Amos read it at the kitchen table while Edna was marking papers across from him, and his face went very still in that particular way that she now recognized as serious. "Cole is in Colorado," he said. She put down her pen. "How far?" "Denver, for now." He folded the letter. "The marshals are watching him, but they can't act without cause. He hasn't done anything illegal since his release." "Watching you from a distance is not illegal," she said. "No," he agreed. She looked at him. "What do we do?" He noticed the "we." She saw him notice it in a slight change of his eyes, not surprise exactly, but something that registered. "I'm going to Denver," he said. I need to talk to the marshal personally and see what they actually know. And I think I need to talk to Cole." She stared at him. "That is an extraordinarily dangerous idea." "It's more dangerous not to," he said. "Cole feeds on uncertainty. He feeds on fear from a distance. If I go to him directly and make clear that I'm not afraid and that I have the full attention of the marshal's office, I think he retreats. He was always a coward underneath the performance of menace. That's what I know about him." She thought about this. It made sense in a way that she found infuriating because she wanted to argue with it. "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "Amos." "No," he said again, not harshly but with the finality that she had learned was not negotiable. "You will stay here with Pete. The school needs you. This is not your fight." "You're making it mine," she said. He met her gaze. "I'm trying not to," he said quietly. "That's part of the reason I told you I'm going." She understood what he meant by this. He was trying to minimize the degree to which his dark past intersected with her life, trying to protect the boundaries of her choice, not by hiding things from her, but by handling his own history so that it did not become her obligation. It was, she recognized, an act of considerable love, even if neither of them said that word. "When do you leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning," he said. She did not sleep at all that night. He left before dawn, and she stood on the porch in the cold and watched the shape of him on horseback move away into the dark until she could not see him anymore. And then she went inside and built up the fire and sat beside it with her knees drawn up and felt, with absolute clarity, the contours of what she would lose if he did not come back. She was at school when he returned 2 days later, but Pete came to the schoolhouse in the early afternoon to tell her he was back, and she dismissed the children 20 minutes early without explaining herself, and rode back to the ranch at a pace that Pete, riding beside her, did not comment on. Amos was in the kitchen. He looked tired, deeply tired, the kind of tired that is more than physical, but he was there and he was whole, and she walked in through the door and stopped 3 feet from him and looked at him. "Well," she said. "He's gone," Amos said. "Cole, he had already left Denver when I got there. The marshals think he's headed back east." He paused. "I think he made his calculation. I think he decided that coming for me wasn't worth the cost." She exhaled. The relief was so large it made her knees uncertain for a moment. "Are you sure?" "Not entirely," he said honestly. "But the marshal agrees with my reading of him. Cole was always more interested in power than in actual revenge. He's a businessman in his way. Revenge on me doesn't earn him anything. It only costs him." She stood there looking at him for a moment, and then she crossed the space between them and put her arms around him, which she had not done before, which was the first time she had touched him deliberately and without excuse, and she felt him go very still, and then his arms came around her, and they stood like that in the kitchen for a long moment without speaking. She stepped back. Her face felt warm. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, or had seen and not been willing to name. "I'm glad you're back," she said. "I know," he said softly, and she did not ask him what he meant by that because she knew. March arrived. The snow did not melt overnight in the Colorado Territory. It retreated gradually and stubbornly, conceding ground in inches, so that March was still very much winter despite what the calendar said, the mornings bitter and the afternoons occasionally offering a brief and treacherous warmth that smelled almost like spring, and then withdrew before you could be certain of it. Edna was grading papers at her writing desk on a Tuesday evening in early March when she became aware that the question she had been circling for 2 months had arrived at a point of decision, not because of any external pressure. Amos had not asked her anything. He had not changed his behavior since her return from the porch on the morning he left for Denver, had not pressed the closeness of that kitchen moment into something more, had not made her feel cornered or obligated. He was exactly as he had always been, which was exactly the problem. She put down her pen. She looked out the window at the dark that was the pasture and the mountains beyond it and thought about Davenport, tried to make Davenport real and present in her mind, the boarding house and Margaret and the Cultural Institute, and the life she had been planning to return to. It had faded. That was what she discovered when she tried to bring it close. It had become a sketch where before it had been a painting. The details that had seemed solid and definitive in October were now soft and uncertain, not because anything had changed in Davenport, but because something had changed in her, something fundamental in what she understood about what a life should feel like and what she was willing to accept as enough. She went to find Amos. He was in the sitting room with a book he was not reading. She could tell because he was looking at the same page he had been looking at 20 minutes ago when she had walked through. He looked up when she came in. "I have a question," she said. "All right," he said. She sat down across from him, not on the chair she usually took by the fire but in the one closer to his, which was a small but deliberate choice. "If I were to stay," she said carefully, "not just through spring, if I were to consider staying past spring, what would that look like?" He closed the book without marking the page. He looked at her with that complete and quiet attention. "What do you mean by look like?" he said. "I mean, what are you offering?" She said, because she had never been a woman who was willing to approach a thing sideways when she could approach it straight. "I need to understand what you're actually asking because I have been very carefully not asking you what you're asking for months now, and I think that has been a mistake." "It hasn't been a mistake," he said. "It's been respectful of what you said." "And what I said was that I was leaving in spring," she said, "and I'm sitting here in March asking you what you would say to the alternative." He was quiet for a long moment, not hesitating, thinking with the seriousness he gave to serious things. "I would say," he said finally, "that I would like you to stay. That I have wanted you to stay since approximately the second week of November and have spent the time since then trying to be honest enough about what this life is that you could make an actual choice about it instead of a romantic one." She looked at him. "You've been showing me the truth of it deliberately." "Yes," he said. "I didn't want you to stay because I made it beautiful. I wanted you to stay if you stayed because you understood it." "The hard parts," she said. "All the parts," he said. She thought about the eastern ridge in winter, and the frozen creek and Pete's story about a man who chose peace, and the dark night outside Clara's cabin and the kitchen in the early morning with the fire and the coffee tin, and a letter she had written to protect herself from exactly this moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have been so frightened of making the same mistake I made with Charles Whitmore that I have been refusing to see that you are not that mistake." "I know about the fear," he said. "I've been watching it, without saying anything. It wasn't my fear to argue with," he said. "It was yours." She felt her chest tighten with something large and complicated and not unpleasant. "I'm not easy," she said. "I should tell you that. I have strong opinions about things and I don't like being managed, and I'm going to have opinions about the school and the community that might not always be convenient." "I know," he said, and the word was so warm and unworried that it almost undid her entirely. "Amos," she said. "Edna," he said. "I don't want to leave," she said. "I haven't wanted to leave since January, and it has been an enormous amount of work pretending otherwise." He stood up from his chair. He crossed to where she was sitting and crouched down to her level so that they were face to face, and he took her hand with the careful deliberateness of a man who is doing something he has thought about for a long time. "Then don't," he said. She looked at him, this man who had chosen peace and shown her what choosing meant, and she said, "All right." He kissed her then, and it was not what she had expected from a man of such stillness. It was warm and serious and absolutely certain, the way he was about everything that mattered to him, and she kissed him back with the full force of what she had been keeping carefully behind walls since November, and when they finally broke apart she had her forehead against his and was laughing quietly at something that did not have words. "I wrote you a letter," she said. "I know," he said. "It was a very foolish letter." "It was an honest letter," he said. "At the time." She leaned back and looked at him. "What changed?" "Everything," she said, and meant it completely. The spring that Edna had said she would leave by came in April of 1879, with the slow and then sudden urgency of springs in the Colorado Territory. The snow retreating from the south-facing slopes first, and the creeks running loud and cold, and the pastures turning a green so bright and new It seemed almost improbable after the white months. Edna did not leave. She stood on the porch of the Watkins ranch on the first morning that smelled genuinely like spring, warm and green and alive, and Amos came and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. And she looked out at the mountains with the snow still on the high peaks and the valley running green below them and felt something settle in her so completely that she understood for the first time what it felt like to actually arrive somewhere. "I was supposed to be packing," she said. "Were you?" he said. "That was the agreement. You renegotiated," he said. She smiled into her coffee. "I did. I renegotiated very thoroughly." He put his arm around her shoulders in the same way he had on that cold night outside Clara's door, and she leaned into it. And the morning was warm and getting warmer, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture, and Pete was whistling something tuneless and cheerful from the direction of the barn. They were married in June. The wedding was at the church in Harlan's Creek, performed by the preacher and attended by what appeared to be the majority of the valley, including Gerald Fitch and his fully recovered wife Agnes, and Clara with May, who had grown a full inch since the winter and was no longer coughing, and who had presented Edna with a hand-picked bouquet of early summer wildflowers with the serious ceremony of someone who understands the importance of the occasion. Edna wore her best dress, green wool that was not a wedding dress, but that Amos had looked at when she put it on as though it were the finest garment he had ever seen. And she had flowers in her hair that she had done herself and that Margaret, who had taken the stage from Davenport specifically for the occasion, had said were very becoming. Margaret had cried 3 separate times before the ceremony even started, which Edna found endearing rather than excessive, because Margaret was someone who felt things at full volume, and Edna had always loved this about her. Margaret had also, upon meeting Amos, pulled Edna aside and said in a low and urgent voice, "You almost left this man," in a tone that communicated clearly that this would have been an act of historical foolishness. "I know," Edna had said. "You were going to pack your trunks and go back to Davenport. I know. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking," Edna said, "that I was protecting myself, and then I was wrong and I stopped." Margaret had hugged her for a long moment and then said, very practically, "He had better be as steady as he looks, or I will personally come back to Colorado and cause him difficulties." He was as steady as he looked. The summer of 1879 was the most alive that Edna had ever felt in her life. The ranch in summer was a different world from the ranch in winter, the same bones but wearing entirely different clothing, green and loud with birds, and warm in a way that held rather than oppressed. She continued teaching through the summer because there were families who wanted it, and because she was, at her core, a teacher in the way that some people are constitutively something. It was not what she did so much as what she was. She and Amos talked about the school the way he had said they would, directly and seriously. And in August she wrote a proposal to the school board for an expanded building, with Amos's offer of funding attached, and Gerald Fitch read it and looked up and said, "I think that's the best idea anyone has brought to this board in 2 years." The new school began construction in September, and Edna oversaw the specifications with a precision that the carpenter initially found surprising and then came to respect. She wrote to Margaret regularly. She wrote about the ranch and the valley and the community and the way winter had returned in October with the same seriousness as the year before, and the way she now looked at the first snow, not with the apprehension of an outsider, but with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly how good the fire was going to feel when she came inside. She wrote about Amos, but only in the way that you write about air, by describing everything around it, because some things are so fundamental to your existence that you do not describe them directly, you just live inside them. The letter she received from Margaret in November contained, in its second paragraph, a piece of information that Edna read twice with a smile that she felt all the way through. Charles Whitmore's marriage, Margaret wrote, had lasted 14 months before the woman with good family connections had decided that Whitmore's company was insufficient compensation for his limitations, and he was now living again in Davenport in a state of considerable public embarrassment. Margaret reported this with the neutral tone of someone relaying facts, but the brief parenthetical at the end said, "I thought you should know, if only to confirm that the universe occasionally has a sense of justice." Edna folded the letter and put it in her writing desk and felt, with no particular satisfaction and also a small, private satisfaction, that she had escaped something she had not known at the time she needed to escape. She was sitting at that same writing desk 2 months later, the December snow coming down outside, when she realized that she was going to need to tell Amos something that was going to require a different kind of conversation. She found him in the barn, which was where she found him most afternoons, and she stood in the barn doorway with the cold air behind her and the warm hay and horse smell in front of her and said, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the horse he was brushing. The horse was a bay mare named Stella who had opinions about most things and had taken a cautious liking to Edna over the summer. "All right," he said. "I believe," she said, "that we are going to have a child." The quality of stillness that came over him was different from any of his other stills. It was not the processing stillness or the careful stillness or the protective stillness. It was the stillness of someone receiving news so significant that the ordinary mechanisms of response require a moment to calibrate. Then he put down the brush and crossed the barn to her and took her face in both his large, careful hands and looked at her with an expression that she filed immediately and permanently in the category of things she would need to look at for the rest of her life. "Are you certain?" he said. "As certain as I can be at this point," she said. "There will need to be a doctor in the spring." "I'll go to Denver," he said. "I'll bring a doctor back." "That is an excessive reaction," she said. "I don't think so," he said, and kissed her with a gentleness that she understood was for both of them. The spring of 1880 was the spring Edna had been supposed to leave, in the original accounting of things. 1 year after the original spring she had promised to stay until. Instead she was watching from the porch, considerably rounder than the previous April, as the mountains shed their snow and the valley turned green, and when the doctor that Amos had indeed brought from Denver confirmed everything with professional thoroughness. She sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and felt the fullness of the life she had built settling around her like something that had been made specifically for her dimensions. The baby was born in June of 1880, a boy that they named Thomas, after Amos's father who had died in Kentucky 10 years before, and whose death was one of the reasons Amos had first come west, looking for something to put in the space that grief had made. Thomas arrived in the world with considerable noise and a clear set of opinions about it, and May, who came to visit with Clara 3 days after the birth, looked at him with the critical assessment of a child who has heard a great deal about babies and is now forming her own conclusion. "He's red," May said. "They all are at first," Edna told her. "Will he stay red?" "No," Edna said. "Good," May said, apparently satisfied, and went to sit next to Amos and tell him about the book she was reading, which was one of the ones Edna had brought from her school library. Amos sat with May on the porch bench and explained the difficult parts of the book with his characteristic patience, while Edna sat in the shade with Thomas and listened and felt something so complete and uncomplicated in its rightness that she could only call it happiness and trust that the word was large enough for what she meant. Clara, sitting beside her, said quietly, "You almost left, didn't you?" "I did," Edna said. "What stopped you?" She looked at Amos on the bench with May, pointing at something in the pages. "He stopped trying to stop me," she said. "He just kept being himself and I stopped being afraid of it." Clara considered this. "That sounds about right," she said. "The new school opened in September of 1880. It was twice the size of the original building, with 3 proper windows on each side, and a new stove that could actually heat the room and proper desks for 25 children, rather than the improvised arrangements that had been making do. Edna stood in the middle of it, the morning it opened, and felt a proprietary pride that she recognized was perhaps excessive for a building she had not built, and then decided that it was not excessive at all because she had built it in the way that mattered, through the months of argument and proposal and insistence, and the specific use of Amos Watkins's belief in her judgment. He came to the opening with Thomas on his hip, Thomas now being 4 months old and sufficiently curious about the world to look around with bright, interested eyes at everything, which Edna took as evidence of good character. Amos stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the new desks and the proper windows, and the children already filing in with the combination of excitement and reluctance that characterized children everywhere on the first day of school. "Well," Edna said, "it's a good school," he said. "It is," she agreed. "And it'll need a second teacher before too long. The valley is growing." He looked at her. "We'll find one," he said. "We should write to the Teacher's Gazette," she said. "Yes," he said, "we probably should." She took Thomas from him because Thomas had begun the particular wriggling that indicated he had strong feelings about the current situation, and she settled him against her shoulder and looked at Amos in the doorway of the school she had built and thought about the posting in a gazette 2 years ago, and a dare and 2 glasses of sherry, and the stage that had brought her here. She thought about the letter she had written in January of that first winter, with its careful schoolteacher hand and its certainty about spring, and about the way Amos had walked out into the snow and read it and come back inside and said nothing, and then, quietly, inexorably, spent the rest of the winter being the truest version of himself. She had said she would only stay until spring. He had spent all winter changing her mind. He had not done it with arguments or promises or romantic speeches. He had done it by showing her a frozen creek that was still alive underneath the ice, and by putting candles next to a writing desk, and by crouching down to speak to a small child with the same seriousness he used with everyone, and by saying the word choice as though it were a sacred thing, and by holding her in the dark outside a sick room, and by riding to Denver to face a dangerous man so that she would not have to carry the weight of it, and by refusing to fight her stated intention and instead showing her, every single day, what the alternative to it looked like. The alternative looked like this: Thomas on her shoulder smelling of milk and clean cotton. Amos in the doorway of a school they had made happen together. The mountains above the valley wearing the first snow of a new season on their peaks, which she now looked at with affection rather than apprehension. Pete Colby whistling something tuneless in the general direction of the livery stable. Clara and May walking down the street with May carrying 3 books from the library under her arm. The alternative was a life that had chosen her back. The years that followed wore the texture of the life Edna had built rather than the life she had planned. And the difference between those 2 things turned out to be the most important thing she ever understood about herself. Thomas learned to walk in the spring of 1881, and learned to run approximately 6 minutes later, and spent the summer of his first year conducting a systematic investigation of every dangerous object on the ranch, while Pete Colby, who had appointed himself unofficial guardian, tracked him with the resigned dedication of a cattle dog who understands that the job is never really done. Edna taught school through that year, and the next with a second teacher she had found through the Gazette, a young woman named Ruth Hewitt from Kansas City, who arrived with 1 trunk and a firm handshake, and turned out to be exactly the right kind of person, practical and imaginative and not afraid of either the altitude or the cattle, and who within 6 months had become part of the community in the way that people who are right for a place become part of it quickly. Ruth's arrival in Harlan's Creek coincided with a shift in the town's fortunes that everyone could feel, but that took time to identify. The railroad had reached within 50 miles of the valley. It would come closer. Everyone knew it, and the people who knew it were already making decisions about whether to stay or to go, whether the arrival of the railroad meant opportunity or meant the end of the specific intimate scale that had made Harlan's Creek what it was. Amos and Edna talked about this at length, at the kitchen table and on the porch in the evenings, and riding the East Ridge on Saturdays when Pete was watching Thomas, and their conversations had by now that quality of two minds that have learned each other's contours thoroughly, that can disagree directly and respectfully, and arrive somewhere neither of them started. "The railroad will bring more people," Edna said one evening. "That means more children, more school. It means the town changes," Amos said. "Not always better, not always worse either," she said. "No," he agreed, "but different, and different requires decisions. Such as what we want this valley to look like in 20 years, he said. "Whether we're going to shape it or let it be shaped." She looked at him. "Is that a choice?" "It's always a choice," he said, and smiled at her. And she smiled back because they had been having versions of this conversation for 3 years, and the word choice between them now had a whole private history. Thomas's second birthday came in June of 1882, celebrated with a cake that Della made, and that Thomas investigated with his hands before he investigated with his mouth, leaving a comprehensive record of his exploration in the frosting. The guests included the Fitch family and Clara and May and Pete and Ruth Hewitt, and a collection of children from the school who regarded Thomas with the mixed feelings of people who know they should be generous and are working on it. May, now 9 years old and reading at a level that Edna was actively working to accommodate, brought Thomas a carved wooden horse that her uncle had made, and Thomas received it with the gravity of a child receiving a serious gift, and carried it with him for the rest of the day with such focused attention that Edna found herself moved in an unexpected way by the sight of him, this small person who was entirely his own self already, entirely new. That summer Edna found herself again with the particular awareness that had preceded her conversation with Amos in the December of Thomas's first year. And this time, she sat down at her writing desk and wrote not a letter to protect herself from something, but a letter to Margaret telling her what was happening with a warmth and straightforwardness that she recognized was very different from the careful self-monitoring of the woman who had stepped off the stage in Harlan's Creek 3 years before. The second child arrived in February of 1883. A girl this time, born in the deep of winter with the snow coming down and the fire high in the hearth, and the Dr. Amos kept now in regular contact with making the journey from the nearest town in conditions that were not ideal, and that he muttered about in a professional undertone that Edna found darkly funny between contractions. They named her Anna, after Edna's mother who had died when Edna was 12, and whose face she could no longer entirely reconstruct in her memory, but whose quality of warmth she thought she remembered with something beyond ordinary recollection. Anna was a different sort of person from Thomas immediately, quieter and more watchful, with an expression in repose that Amos said looked exactly like Edna's professional face, and that Edna said was a fabrication. Anna slept deeply and ate deliberately, and regarded the world with a considered attention that suggested she was forming opinions she would share when ready. Thomas's reaction to Anna was complicated in the way that 3-year-old responses to fundamental changes in the order of their universe are complicated. He was generous toward her in public and periodically resentful in private, which Edna found entirely understandable and managed with the patient honesty she brought to the classroom, explaining things clearly and trusting that the explanation would land in time. It did. By April, Thomas had made his peace with Anna's existence and had begun treating her with a proprietary affection, showing her things with the serious instruction of someone who knows a great deal and wants to share it, which she received with her watchful attention, and which Edna stood in the doorway and watched with a fullness in her chest that she had no adequate word for. The railroad reached 10 miles from Harlan's Creek in 1884, and the town council spent 6 months arguing about what to do about it, and Amos served on the committee that eventually made the decision that would set the course for the next generation of the valley. He came home from the final meeting in October looking tired but satisfied. "We're getting a spur line," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Connected to the main line?" Edna asked. "In 2 years if the funding holds," he said. "Means the valley opens up to trade in a significant way, and the town, "Will grow," he said. Significantly, he paused. "I also offered the north acreage." She looked up. "You've been wanting that land." "I've been wanting what's good for the valley more than I've been wanting specific acreage," he said. "There's a developer who will put proper worker housing on it if the railroad comes through. That's more important than me extending my pasture." She looked at him across the kitchen table for a long moment. He was 37 years old, and he wore his years the way the mountains wore their snow, substantially and without apology. And she loved him with the complete and specific love that you develop for something you know entirely. All the rooms and all the corners and all the particular qualities of light. "Have I told you lately," she said, "that I almost left?" He met her eyes and the corner of his mouth lifted. "Once or twice," he said. "I almost got on a stage to Davenport," she said. "In April of 1879 I had my trunks." "You hadn't packed them," he said. "I was thinking about packing them very seriously." "I know," he said. "What did you know? You didn't know anything." "I knew you were still here," he said. "That was what I knew." She sat back in her chair and looked at this man who had gone about his life with such patient and complete integrity for all of that first winter, who had shown her the frozen creek and the eastern ridge and every hard and beautiful thing he was, and had let her make her own decision in her own time, who had changed her mind without ever trying to change it. "You were very patient," she said. "I had something worth being patient for," he said. In the spring of 1885, 6 years after the spring she had promised to leave by, Edna walked the East Ridge for the first time with both Thomas and Anna. Thomas now 5 and running ahead with the limitless energy of a child who has not yet discovered the concept of fatigue. Anna now 2 and riding on Amos's shoulders with both hands on his hat for balance, and expressing her opinions about everything she saw in the clear, direct manner she had been developing since she first found words. The mountains still had snow on the high peaks. The valley was green in the way that April green in Colorado is green, young and almost incandescent, as though the color is still deciding how serious it intends to be. The creek in the south pasture was running loud and cold from the melt, full of itself and going somewhere, and the cattle were moving in the lower pasture with the satisfied, unhurried air of animals that are exactly where they should be. Thomas stopped running and stood at the edge of the ridge looking out at the valley below with his hands on his hips, in an unconscious imitation of his father that made Edna press her hand to her mouth for a moment. "It's big," he said. "Yes," Edna said, coming to stand beside him. "How big?" "Very," she said, "as far as you can see and further." He considered this with the seriousness of a 5-year-old grappling with a concept that is genuinely large. "Will it always be here?" he said. She put her hand on his head. "Yes," she said, "even if we go somewhere." "Even then," she said. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and ran off along the ridge again. Anna, from Amos's shoulders, pointed at something in the distance with the emphatic gesture she used when she wanted specific information. "That's the north pasture," Amos told her, interpreting the gesture with the fluency of practice. "North," Anna said firmly. "Yes," he agreed. Edna fell into step beside him, and he shifted Anna to one arm and put the other around Edna's shoulders, and they walked the ridge in the warm spring morning with the mountains above them and the valley below, and their children's voices bright in the clear air. She thought about the letter. She thought about January and the coffee tin, and the careful schoolteacher hand forming words that were true when they were written, and were also wrong in every way that mattered. She thought about Amos walking out into the snow and coming back inside and not arguing with her, and instead spending the rest of the winter being completely himself. She had said she would only stay until spring. She was standing on the East Ridge in the spring of her 7th year, and the spring had come and gone 6 times now, and each time it had arrived she had stood in it and felt the same thing, the rightness of a life that had chosen her because she had finally chosen it, the deep and lasting peace of being exactly where you meant to be. "What are you thinking?" Amos asked. She looked at him, at the man who had been the best decision she had ever not quite made on purpose. "I'm thinking," she said, "that spring came." He looked at her. His eyes held all the understanding they had been accumulating since October of 1878, all the winters and springs and every conversation over every dinner and every evening by the fire, and the arm around her shoulders tightened briefly in the specific way that meant "I know what you mean" without words. "It did," he said. "And I'm still here," she said. "You are," he said. Anna pointed at something else in the distance. Thomas shouted from the far end of the ridge that he could see all the way to tomorrow. The cattle moved in the green pasture. The creek ran loud with snowmelt below. The mountains stood where they had always stood, snow on the peaks, patient as anything. Edna Watkins, schoolteacher and rancher's wife and builder of schools and maker of a life that was entirely, irreversibly, joyfully her own, looked out at the valley she had almost left 6 times before she stopped being afraid of staying, and breathed the spring air and was home.